world where there's scarcity, you want to collaborate. In a world where there's abundance, you can afford to compete. And we live in a world, at least in the not-for-profit sector, where there's scarcity. There just aren't enough resources to, support all of the beautiful ideas that are out there.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector. Let's get started.
Welcome, listeners, to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm your host, Rich Frazier. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest questions facing nonprofits now. How do we fund our missions and continue serving our communities when government support is shrinking, public funding is unpredictable, and misinformation is muddying the water for donors and policymakers? For many organizations, the last few months have felt like whiplash. Programs at risk, staff stretched thin, and a constant scramble to keep the doors open. We've all heard the advice to diversify your funding, but what does that actually look like in practice? Today's conversation centers on a powerful idea, and that is power ecosystems, what they are, why they matter, and how nonprofits can use them to strengthen their impact, build collective power, and attract private funders who increasingly want to support long-term community-led change. We've brought together a panel with deep-lived experience from philanthropy, community organizing, systems change, and nonprofit fundraising. They're here to help us rethink how nonprofits, funders, and community power can work together more effectively and equitably, especially when the old models are breaking down. Joining me today, Ginger Lee, the founder of Ginger Lee Global Health Consulting Group, Dr. Tony Eiton, CEO of the Health Trust and former vice president of the California Endowment, and Elizabeth Silverstein, founder of Silverstein Funding Solutions and senior partner at Vision Connect Nonprofit Consulting. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to start with you, Ginger. What was the moment where you realized that there was this need for nonprofits and government funders to think bigger?
Hi, Rich. Well, thanks. So, first of all, for inviting us on the podcast. I'm really excited for this conversation. So I've worked almost all of my career in place-based initiatives and in historically disinvested communities. And the reason for that is because that's where I grew up. I grew up in East Oakland and El Paso Heights, Sacramento, which are, some of the most, I would say, some of the lowest income places in the U.S., and I grew up in a big family. We were on public assistance, even though my parents both worked full time. And so I grew up with this contrast of realizing, what it's like to grow up in a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of opportunities, and sort of thinking about that. And I don't know, I just ended up dedicating my career to figuring out how we could maybe change that equation. And then I have been the executive director of a nonprofit, actually two nonprofits, and a development director, and many years in the nonprofit sector, working with community health workers and organizations who are just very good at movement building. And interspersed with that, I worked in 3 different government entities, 2 county and 1 city. And I just started thinking a lot about the different perspectives of those 2 groups, right? How communities view problems and therefore solutions, and how government views those same problems and therefore the solutions. And seeing this sort of disconnect between communities and government. And I just got really curious about that and just thinking what is the magic formula? How does it work when communities are able to be listened to by government, because that's the sweet spot.
Right.
So that's why I just became curious and did my research on that.
So was there a specific community or project where you saw the limits of the traditional approach, where you just said, we can't service deliver our way out of this?
Sure. Yeah, I was working in an organization called Latino Health Access, and we were one of the 14 communities that the California Endowment invested in, and that's when I met you, Tony. And I think that's when I just realized like a lot of the things. I guess it seemed to me that things that communities wanted were sort of falling on deaf ears of government, and so what would it take to raise that community power so government could actually listen?
Tony, how did you get involved in this?
Thank you for having me on the show. And the way I got into this work was really around health. It was healthcare. I'm a medical doctor. And, it seemed to me that many of the drivers of people's health, particularly communities that were lower income, had very little to do with medical care and had so much more to do with just opportunity. And over the years, it became clearer and clearer to me that, these problems were not technocratic problems. They were democratic problems. These were really structured around communities' inability to essentially navigate decision-making apparati, the city council, the board of supervisors, the governor. And it's not like there was an absence of knowledge about how health is injured by depriving people of basic resources like parks and grocery stores and safe places to play and decent education and transportation. That's known. It's well known. But yet we still don't do it. We don't do it. And the question is why? And what it boiled down to for us in our analysis was that communities lacked the power to hold these systems and decision makers accountable. So it became a question for us of how do you build the power of community, essentially build their muscle to participate in the decision-making process. And that's what building healthy communities was about. It was really about strengthening communities' voice and their ability, both technical and political, to essentially demand from government a more equitable allocation of health protective resources.
So, can you explain the idea of a power ecosystem and how it relates to philanthropy?
The concept of an ecosystem is that traditionally in philanthropy, there have been kind of two strands of philanthropy, and government falls a little bit into this category too. And that is one is sort of a more charitable kind of mindset, which is sort of like, society is basically fair, and there are just some things that sort of don't quite work in the existing market system. And so charity is necessary to kind of like reduce the harm of, some of maybe capitalism's impacts on communities or the inefficiencies associated with how our society is structured. There's another mindset, which is that, our society is really not producing the kind of outcomes that we would like to see, particularly for low-income people. And therefore, we need to think about some sort of, constant pressure to reform our core systems and to think about, a movement like change to produce equity. And when you're talking about movements, it invokes ecosystems because movements are they're characterized by a constellation of actors. You have people that are, out on the street protesting. You have people who are doing research. You have people who are doing funding. You have people who are doing financial analysis. You have people who are doing communications and messaging. And so if you're thinking about trying to support movement work, you're thinking about ecosystem. So you're thinking about how do you kind of like support kind of a cluster of actors working together, in some sort of harmony, as opposed to the charitable mindset, which is like, well, let's give more money to the food bank because people are hungry and we can help them be fed.
So how does this differ from, say, a collaborative?
Well, a collaborative implies more of a short-term kind of almost transactional association. Typically collaboratives are associated with, some piece of policy advocacy. You bring a collaborative together, a coalition together to essentially achieve some sort of policy end, or sometimes a service end, quite frankly. I mean, different people working in the same area. Food is a great example. The food banks, the pantries, the folks that are doing Meals on Wheels, some folks doing home food delivery to fragile seniors. They might get together in a collaborative to figure out how to share resources and coordinate their activity. An ecosystem is a bunch of sort of actors that may not be just oriented around a single issue. They are folks that have skills that can be applied to a wide diversity of issues. So, for instance, the researchers, they may be university-based. They may be able to do, an analysis of sort of the impact of a policy on income distribution. That policy may be a health policy. It may be a wage policy or what have you. You have funders that may fund in certain areas. They may fund in health. They may fund in education. You may have an issue that, sort of spans both health and education. So you want to bring in multiple funders that are looking at this issue from different perspectives. So ecosystem is sort of a state of play thing. There are always a bunch of people that are kind of, in some way involved in an issue, and you have to get enough of them together to get kind of critical mass around this issue to spawn some movement. Whereas a collaborative is typically, not always, but typically focused on a single goal.
And I will say I've seen collaboratives become ecosystems as well. Like, for example, the Best Start collaboratives that I've been working with are focused on children 0 to 5 and their families, but there are so many issues that affect children 0 to 5 and their families, right? So it seems to me like collaboratives can gel or even join other collaboratives to start thinking about, okay, what are the root causes of all these problems that we're addressing as single issues? And how can we start showing up for each other's issues, no matter where you are on the direct service, single issue spectrum to all the way to, policy and systems change? How can we start banding together and showing up for each other and coalescing more with like a consciousness of we are building power to influence systems and policies? I've seen that happen.
Beth, do you have something you want to add?
This is all so fascinating, so timely. When we're thinking about ecosystems, and you look at all the different actors that are forming that ecosystem from all the different sectors, the not-for-profit sector is probably the sector that might be a little bit trickier. In our sector, we are the guardians of our mission. So a lot of boards have a hard time thinking beyond their singular not-for-profit. And so, Rich and I have been really working hard on and working with BoardSource on instilling purpose-driven board leadership and the idea that boards have to think beyond themselves. And how does our organization fit within all of the ecosystem of service delivery in which we live? And of course, Renee, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more because so many funders are really starting to raise the bar there for the not-for-profits and asking more of not-for-profits to really be thinking about collective impact, not just collaborations, but where do we go in these steps to get outside of ourselves when that's so counterintuitive. We've been taught that we have to guard our money and we're almost like we're in competition with each other. So that all those silos have to break down in order to get to where you want us to be. So I'd love for you guys to talk through that a little bit more about the culture of this.
Yeah, no, Beth, that's definitely salient and operational in the not-for-profit space and then in the funder space. I will say that, we ran Building Healthy Communities for over a decade, and we watched some of our partners go through that transition from really being focused on service delivery. And, as we all know on this Zoom, not-for-profit work is really hard. I mean, people are struggling to deliver services to people who are also struggling. And, the populations seem to grow all the time, and it tends to be thankless. And when there's an economic downturn, you get defunded. So it's enough to just sort of keep your head above water when you're running a not-for-profit. And so a lot of the agencies, when a funder comes along and says, hey, look, you're working on childcare, and we've got these other folks that are working on childcare, and we think that there may be a policy opportunity here to kind of convince the legislature, for instance, that we need to make some strategic investments in childcare policy. And the not-for-profit director looks up and says, I don't have time for that. I'm busy. just trying to train, family daycare providers, and I don't have enough resources to do that. And so we witnessed a lot of this struggle, to kind of make that transition from pure service delivery to service delivery and some advocacy. And a lot of organizations could not do it. And their boards in particular would say, look, and I think that has to do with the charity mindset. Their boards were kind of like, I got into this to sort of like, help, kids get, good education. I didn't get into this to become quote unquote political. And so, some of these organizations will just sort of step away from any advocacy efforts because they see it as quote unquote political. The challenge, I think, is trying to convince folks that, you're never going to solve these problems just by trying to service them. It's an ethos that is actually in healthcare as well. You're not going to solve the health of a population in an emergency room. You're just going to be able to kind of tamp down sort of the extremes of suffering. But if you want to prevent it, you've got to get out of the emergency room and the four walls of the hospital, and you have to enter into the community and understand how our policies, how we structured opportunity in the world that's making some people get sicker faster in a predictable way than others, and understand how we can prevent that. So I do think that this is realistically a big challenge in the world of not-for-profits, and I'm sure all of us could talk about a lot of the other challenges in the world of not-for-profits, but moving from a charitable mindset or sort of a service mindset into kind of an advocacy and upstream focused mindset is a big lift for folks that are really doing kind of God's work, in the trenches with people who are really suffering.
And there are a lot of organizations who are ready for that shift, and funders who can fund the infrastructure of that shift, right? Like if I'm the ED and I'm too busy to get involved in advocacy, but if a funder was willing to support a position to help with that, or some training for the board, or some other ways to make that shift. And I also think maybe this moment is forcing nonprofits to get a little more involved in mutual aid and to start thinking differently, like the rules are changing or maybe are broken, right? So I think part of the power ecosystem idea too is, even if all you do is this very specific direct service, can you start feeding, like if I, speaking to what Dr. Wrighton just said about upstream, if you think about upstream and downstream, the idea is downstream is people have already fallen in the river and the direct service is pulling them out one by one, right? And upstream is going upstream to prevent people from falling in the river in the first place. But if I'm a person who fell in the river and I need that food bank, then I'm probably pretty passionate about not wanting other people to have to go to the food bank. So even if I'm only the food bank, I can start somehow connecting with other organizations who are doing leadership development and movement building and saying, hey, this is like a natural leader. Maybe this would be a good person for you. And I think this connecting, like even if you're not involved in advocacy and policy, like somehow feeding the pipeline to advocacy and policy is another way to participate.
Ginger, I want to take that just another step further. For someone new to the concept, what's the simplest way to identify the power ecosystem they're already part of?
Yeah, I mean, they may or may not be part of, but I think there's an opportunity to join, right? Like, what are your causes? What are your gaps? For example, if your board is going to be against advocacy, what are the gaps that you would need to participate? Who are the other organizations in your place that are doing things? Can you map out a collective impact? Who's doing what, and how does it all plug into the bigger picture? And where does your organization fit even now? And maybe where would you like to fit, and how could you move in that direction?
And who should be calling the shots in these power ecosystems? Is it the funder? Is it the community? Is it the biggest nonprofit that's part of it? Who are we looking to as a leader?
Well, I teach advocacy, public health advocacy at Berkeley. I've taught it for 17 years, and we help our public health students essentially develop an advocacy plan, and that's part of the way that you kind of suss out, who in the community is doing what, because you're going to need to do some research. You want to figure out who's done the research. You want to talk to those people. You're going to need to do some, analysis, some financial analysis. You want to figure out who's done that. You may have, a legal strategy you want to pursue. So you're going to figure out who's doing that. So that's part of the way that you kind of feel your way around an ecosystem and you figure out who's doing what. In terms of leadership, one of the central tenets of leadership in the 21st century around issues of social justice is that you try to create an environment where those that are most impacted by whatever the inequity is are in the driver's seat in crafting the solution. So you really do want to have, community level residents essentially dictating, what they see the problem is and how they think would be best to solve it, which is not to say that you don't try to provide them with technical expertise and you don't support them in their analysis and decision making. Typically, you want to find organizations that are closest to kind of community residents, and those are typically community organizing groups who are a little bit issue agnostic and much more interested in sort of building out the core power of the community to participate in decision making. So for the most part, we've leaned pretty heavily on community organizing groups because they have that proximity to people who are experiencing the pain of inequity. But it's not traditionally led like, kind of corporate leadership where there's a CEO and, issue or, commands are issued and people follow orders. It really is much more of a kind of a collective leadership and, kind of a dialectical process where people are kind of iterating with each other to try to find truth and the best way forward, while respecting the sort of the primacy of those that are most impacted by whatever the particular issue or issues are.
Okay. Ginger, did you want to add to that?
Oh, that was just so beautifully said. Yeah, I mean, I guess the power ecosystems that I've seen that have been really effective have been comprised of very thoughtful people who are leading their organizations with this idea that we will collectively decide what we're working on, we'll help each other show up for each other, and we'll build the skills we need to build, whether that's deep dives into, getting very comfortable talking about racial inequity or whatever it seems like the group needs, and doing a lot of leadership development with the core base so that this core base can sort of move agilely and be responsive. Yeah. And I think a lot of kind of taking care of each other and even sometimes deciding not to compete against each other. It's been a lot of very thoughtful, beautiful people leading these movements.
Yeah. So then what are some of the challenges then of collaborating with others in our power ecosystems? Because it's not all rosy and unicorns in the nonprofit sector, right?
No, it's messy business.
Yeah, it is.
And it's beautiful, messy business. I mean, just like democracy is. I think a lot of the issues that Ginger highlighted are some of the impediments. We like to say in the funder world that, we encourage our grantees not to compete, which is, kind of unrealistic, quite frankly. But in a world where there's scarcity, you want to collaborate. In a world where there's abundance, you can afford to compete. And we live in a world, at least in the not-for-profit sector, where there's scarcity. There just aren't enough resources to, support all of the beautiful ideas that are out there. And so, funders I like to call philanthropy as a business where you're spending most of your day saying no to really good ideas because you just don't have the resources to fund all of the great ideas that come across your threshold. Mm-hmm. So, you're trying to encourage people to collaborate in a world where they feel very concerned about having inadequate resources and trying to keep the lights on. I think, Ginger also alluded to sort of racial and structural kind of, tension, a historical legacy of communities that have been separated and treated differently based on their racial status, their ethnic status, their immigration status, their gender status, their, LGBTQIA plus status. that, communities have been pitted against each other historically in this country very intentionally. And having to work through some of that conflict and historical trauma is critical to bringing people together on the same page. And that's not easy. So there are a lot of those kinds of barriers to contend with, as well as, quite frankly, kind of, I think, some philosophical differences in the not just in the not-for-profit community, but in the larger kind of society about poverty and, how amenable some of these issues are to change. Some people just sort of take it as a given that, we live in a capitalist society. You're going to have winners and you're going to have losers. And it's like, it's too bad. I just don't want to be one of them. And so, they don't necessarily even believe that you can actually solve these problems. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges in this work.
I think another gift that funders can give nonprofits is the gift of time to work through all of these issues, to have the patience that it takes to be able to work amongst themselves and with community members for this healing and for this whatever sort of development might be needed to be able to work together, and sort of consciousness raising about anti-colonialism and how do we deconstruct these racial separations and different separations. And that all takes a lot of time and it can be painful. And I love the idea of a funder who's just there for that, right? Showing up for that and funding it and being patient with that.
And I also think too, just in this time, we've been bombarded with every possible change that someone would never have even thought of. But in addition to the philosophical shifts, that we all have to make and that all of our not-for-profits have to make, and, and the cultural shifts, the idea that maybe not every not-for-profit is supposed to be a one-stop shop. We shouldn't have all of the services in one place. Maybe we find our superpower, and then we find somebody else's superpower, and then we bring them all together. And that is the start of an ecosystem right there, where we have identified our lane and we understand that other people are in their lanes and that maybe we're better together instead of trying to just be a one-stop shop for everything. That's a huge cultural shift in the mindset of a not-for-profit. And I think from a funder's perspective, encouraging those dialogues is so critical. Giving not-for-profits permission to maybe not be everything for everybody, but to find those natural partners and then to join together and go to a funder with a joint proposal, 3 or 4 not-for-profits together.
Ginger, can you talk about the funder's perspective? What's changing about what funders want to accomplish with the organizations they support?
For sure. I was talking to a funder the other day, and he said, we've just been, how did he put it? Because there have been so many crises, right? We're in this poly crisis. So like wildfires and all the things. And he was saying, we've just been shotgunning out Band-Aids. And I was like, oh gosh, and I think a lot of funders right now are trying to make this shift of like, okay, the shotgunning out Band-Aids approach isn't moving the needle. So how can we, okay, here's a Band-Aid, and how are we working to change this? And so thinking from that point of view as a nonprofit, like, okay, what am I doing? Yes. And how is that connected to a larger social issue or many social issues? And how can I frame that in a way that funders can hear and understand and get excited about, right? Even if it is a direct service, how are you connecting to a larger social issue and helping to move that? And how are you articulating that in a way that that a funder that could be attractive to funders? And of course, not faking it, not doing something you're not doing, only if you really are doing that. But sometimes I think it's just like a reframing for nonprofits as well about how they think about what they're already doing.
Well, so let's look at the other side of the coin. Tony, I'm looking at you now. So for nonprofits that might feel stuck in the service-only mode, right? So they're doing great work, but they're not making any influence or having any influence on systems change. Where do they start? How do they start?
Well, one of the first things that those organizations can do, and I'm working with several of them right now. We have federally qualified health centers that are, experiencing a major hit because of the Medicaid, funding cuts and projected cuts. Working with, food banks and food pantries who are dealing with the federal government's cuts across the board, not just the pause that was associated with the government shutdown, but also the federal government is pulling back on ag support, pulling back on, the ability of schools to buy, healthy foods. And so, they're all basically kind of in this sort of tumultuous state, trying to figure out, well, how do we move forward given that the resources are clearly being constrained, and funders similarly are actually feeling constraints as well. One of my old bosses used to say, he had this sort of, this allegory of which was, one year you get sort of some material to make a dress. And so you go to the sewing machine and you sit down and you make this beautiful dress and you hand it to your client and the client says, thank you very much. And the next year you get a little less material. And so now you're like, well, I don't have enough to make a dress. Well, maybe I'll make a skirt. And so you hand that to your client. And the client's like, oh, this is great. And next year you get even less. And you're like, well, I can't make a skirt. Maybe I can make a bathing suit. And you hand that to your client. And your client's like, oh, thanks very much. And then the following year you get so little material and you can't make anything anymore. And so it becomes at some point, kind of impossible to continue the way that you've always been. And I think that is kind of the wake-up call for a lot of not-for-profits. They're like, I can't make this work in the traditional way. I have to do something else, which means I have to reach out to people who are similarly situated. And we have to find supports from people who maybe have a little bit of influence at the policy level. Maybe we want to redesign what it is that we offer. Maybe we want to start, kind of rethinking, what is this product that we're creating, whether it's health or it's, addressing food insecurity. Can we do this in some other more creative way? Can we find efficiencies across many different providers? But you're forced to kind of rethink what it is that you can do. And I think part of the opportunity is sort of like thinking beyond just delivering services and thinking about, well, how do I start to have some impact on sort of the policy realm that shapes the conditions that people find themselves in, that makes them need these services?
Beth, did you want to jump in?
So, this is such a profoundly important topic for us to think about. It is way bigger than we think it is. It sounds so easy to just say we're going to create an ecosystem, but it is not easy work. It's very, very difficult work, and it needs some facilitation. And so, I kind of toss this back to you, Ginger, because that's kind of where your career has taken you as a facilitator to create these power ecosystems. Can you tell us a little bit more about that facilitation side?
Oh, sure. Actually, I'd love to talk about the FAIR model, if I may, because I think that plays into it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Dr. Eichen is actually a co-author with me on this model, as are two other people, Dr. Lisa Staten and Dr. Kasia Chabanovska. And we studied the California endowments, successful policy changes led by communities. I've seen different numbers, but there were at least 1,200, more like 2,000 successful, really significant systems and policy changes led by 14 historically marginalized communities. And so we wanted to know how that happened and sort of what were the mechanisms behind that. And that's how we developed this model called the Public Health and Racial Equity Model for Systems Change. If someone wants to download it, they can go to my website, gingerlyglobal.com, and follow along. But what we discovered is there were sort of these 5 domains of how this whole thing worked. And it started off with domain 1 being this grant maker readiness domain, which is what do communities wish grant makers knew before they went into their communities. And a lot of this is around racial and structural inequities, because sometimes funders can go into communities and do more harm and reinforce the status quo, and we really want to avoid that, right? So that's domain 1. The second one is called Preparation for Transformational Change. And that's where we start building these power ecosystems. So what are the approaches to grant making that support, like you were saying, Beth, that sort of help facilitate these power ecosystems? And then the third domain is called leverage points for deep change, because we don't want shallow change. Shallow change is easy. Deep change is harder. And so what were these leverage points for deep change during these 1200 to 2000 systems and policy changes that actually did create the change? And so those are things like narrative change that I know you've covered a lot in your podcast, and sort of increasing the transparency of government and some things like that. And then the fourth domain is called the multiple streams framework. It comes from the work of John Kingdon, and it talks about how policies and systems actually change. And then who are the policy entrepreneurs who take advantage of an open policy window to make that change. And then finally, once this policy window is open and the community that has the power is sort of advancing this policy that they would like to see to change things in to improve conditions or whatever the issue is, they either get what they ask for or they don't, right? They win or they lose. And if they win, we still have to have community oversight and make sure that the change is actually funded and implemented as intended by the community. But sometimes communities don't get what they ask for. And so then there's a sort of regrouping process, and hopefully the funder sticks with them during that process, so they can reapproach, so they can build more power and reapproach, maybe get some legal support or whatever support they need. And the idea then is, if we go through this process of building these community ecosystems, engaging in these leverage points for deep change, pushing on the systems, changing a policy, then we ultimately, hope to influence the social and commercial determinants of health. So that's how the model works. And I facilitate trainings and would love to facilitate anyone through this process.
Thank you for sharing that. So let's get to the practical advice part of the conversation today. What advice can you offer to listeners who want to connect with others in their power ecosystems? What steps can they take today? And how can they start having conversations with funders?
I think this concept of relationships is a really important concept, and this concept of trust. And so I would say showing up at things and meeting people who are working in the same community that you're working in, building those trust, building the trust, building the relationships. But also, like Dr. Eiton mentioned earlier, doing some research on who is doing what in your community and how can you connect with that. I would say those would be two good places to start.
Tony?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that sometimes people think of funders as just sort of like these sterile bags of money, and it's just basically I need to perform for the funder so I can get, sort of a cut of the cash. And, funders, for the most part, I'm not going to say that this is true across the board, but for the most part are pretty knowledgeable about the communities in which they fund. They've had relationships with folks in those communities generally for a long period of time, and they tend to bring people from those same communities into the organization as program officers and the like. So they're a pretty good source of information. And people sometimes get intimidated when they meet with funders. They think they've got to put a proposal in front of somebody. That's the only role of the funder. But sometimes it's worth just calling up your program officer and inviting them to coffee and just asking them about what they see, what they know, what's going on this issue in this place, and who else should I be talking to? Funders really like to be engaged in that way. And they tend to have some pretty good information that other people may not have access to.
I think that's an excellent point. Will you ask the next question, Beth?
This is a good question. So Ginger, you first, and then Tony, I'd like to give you something to think about. Looking ahead, what gives you the most hope about the future of fundraising and philanthropy?
I'm really encouraged by the shift toward sort of less separated and fragmented funding, and funding that's cohesive And I don't know, I'm hoping that this sort of societal breakdown thing we're all experiencing is an opportunity. It is a way for us to wake up a little bit more and band together with like-minded people a little bit more and join the movements that exist and start some new ones.
Amen. Tony?
I'm encouraged by a couple things. One is the increasing awareness of the role of narrative in both movement building and in our larger society, and people developing some expertise in essentially shifting narratives and sort of reframing issues so that more people can understand them and support them. I'm also encouraged by increasing, although it's slower than I'd like to see, awareness amongst funders of the role of power building and how many of these issues are political issues, small p political. Sometimes I define politics as the struggle over the allocation of limited and precious social resources. And it's the ability to sort of help communities engage effectively in those struggles that I think more and more funders are starting to recognize. And then the third thing is really kind of the role of youth and the way that they've engaged social media and have kind of created this sort of like other sort of power, kind of factor in the ability to kind of move an idea very quickly and to mobilize others to act very quickly in ways that we haven't seen in the past. And I think that is a potentially very powerful tool for social movements. And learning from young people about how they use those tools has been very exciting to me.
That's an excellent point. I want to thank you, Ginger and Tony and Beth, for being on the show today, for your insights and your perspectives. If listeners want to continue the conversation with you, Ginger and Tony, where can they reach you, Ginger?
My website is gingerleeglobal.com, and my email address is ginger@gingerleeglobal.com. And I would love to have a conversation with anyone about what you're working on and see if we can see some opportunities for any kind of a shift. Love to listen to you.
Tony?
You can reach me at tony@healthtrust.org, all one word. And, always interested to talk to people who are struggling with these challenges and are looking to impact broadly social and health equity.
Thank you very much. And Beth?
Beth at visionconnectllc.com. And we always want to have these conversations. We just want to keep the conversations flowing. And thank you to both of you for your insights today.
Great. And thank you. And listeners, we value your input. Please reach out and let us know how we're doing. If you have a topic or guest suggestion, please send us an email with the subject heading MPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. You can also use that as an opportunity to tell our producer, Curtis Schmidt, how awesome he is, as I am doing so right now. Curtis, thank you so much for making us all sound wonderful. And thank you, listener, for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.